Working the night shift at the small-town gas station had always been a mundane, albeit eerie, experience. The isolation of the night, the distant hum of the highway, and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only companions. But one fateful night, my perception of the ordinary was forever shattered. It was 2 a.m. when I heard the bell above the entrance jingle, signaling the arrival of a customer. I looked up from my magazine, surprised by the late-night visitor. A tall man, dressed in a tattered coat, entered the store. His face was concealed by the hood of his jacket, and he moved with a slow, deliberate gait. I greeted him with a nod, but he didn't respond. Instead, he went straight to the back of the store where the coolers holding drinks were located. I watched him through the security cameras, growing increasingly uneasy. He opened a cooler, retrieved a can of soda, and placed it on the counter. His movements were odd, as if he were sleepwalking. I rang up the purchase, but he didn't offer any money. Instead, he simply stared at me with vacant eyes. "Sir, your soda," I said, trying to remain calm. Without a word, he turned and left the store, the bell above the door jingling again. I was relieved to see him go, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. An hour passed, and I had almost convinced myself that the encounter had been a bizarre but harmless incident. That's when the phone rang, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The store's phone was rarely used, especially at this hour. I picked up the receiver, my voice trembling. "Hello?" Static crackled on the other end, and then a voice emerged, a low, raspy whisper that chilled me to the bone. "He's coming for you." My heart raced as I tried to comprehend the message. Who's coming for me? Who is this? The voice on the other end grew more insistent, more urgent. "He's coming. He's almost here." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in horror, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who had called, and what did they mean? Suddenly, the bell above the entrance jingled again, and I turned to see the same hooded man from earlier standing in the doorway. This time, his hood had fallen back, revealing a face twisted with madness. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and his lips curled into a menacing grin. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you? What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he advanced toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I reached for the phone to call the police, but it was dead, just like before. As he drew closer, I backed away, my mind racing for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. The man continued to advance, his eyes never leaving mine. I was trapped, alone with this deranged stranger. And then, just as he was about to reach me, the lights in the store flickered and went out, plunging us both into darkness. I heard him laugh, a chilling, maniacal laugh that echoed through the darkness. In that moment, I knew I had to do something, anything, to survive. I fumbled blindly for the nearest object, my fingers closing around the cold metal of a flashlight. I aimed it in the direction of the man and flicked it on. The sudden burst of light illuminated his face, revealing his madness in stark detail. He recoiled, shielding his eyes from the glare. It was the distraction I needed. I bolted for the exit, pushing open the door and stumbling into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of a nearby diner, where I frantically explained what had happened to the police. They arrived at the gas station, but the man was gone, leaving behind only questions and a sense of dread that would haunt me for the rest of my life. To this day, I don't know who the hooded man was or what he wanted, but I do know that he was the embodiment of the nightmares that can lurk in the darkness of the night shift, waiting for the unsuspecting to cross their path.
It was a cold and moonless night when I found myself at Nightfall Hospital. As a night shift nurse, I had grown accustomed to the eerie silence and flickering lights that permeated the building during the late hours. But on this particular night, something far more sinister awaited me. The hospital had a long and dark history, known for its mysterious deaths and inexplicable occurrences. Most staff members whispered about the building being haunted, but I had always been a skeptic, dismissing such tales as mere superstition. That was until that fateful night. My shift began like any other, with the usual routine of checking patients, administering medication, and filling out endless paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow that seemed to drain all warmth from the place. Around midnight, I received a call to check on a patient in room 203. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman, had been admitted with a severe case of pneumonia. Her room was located at the far end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the HVAC system. As I approached Mrs. Henderson's room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Nurse Emily. May I come in?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no response. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing an empty room. The bed was neatly made, and the curtains were drawn shut. Mrs. Henderson was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I rushed to the nurse's station to check the patient records. According to the log, Mrs. Henderson was still in room 203. I knew I had seen her name there earlier that evening. I decided to search the entire floor for her, checking every room and even the supply closets. But Mrs. Henderson had vanished without a trace. I couldn't make sense of it. How could a frail, elderly woman with pneumonia simply disappear? My heart pounded in my chest as I returned to room 203. As I stepped inside, I heard a soft, mournful whisper. "Help me." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be real, I thought. It must be exhaustion playing tricks on me. I followed her gaze and gasped. Outside the window, I saw a procession of shadowy figures, all dressed in hospital gowns, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved silently, as if in a trance, disappearing one by one into the night. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had heard the stories, but this was something beyond anything I could have imagined. It was as if the hospital itself had come to life, its restless spirit seeking something I could not fathom. I approached Mrs. Henderson cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's happening here?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. She continued to point toward the window, her eyes unblinking. "They are waiting," she muttered, her voice a haunting whisper. "Waiting for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For you," she replied, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. I had to get out of that room, out of that hospital. But as I turned to leave, I heard a chorus of whispers, growing louder and more urgent with each passing moment. I rushed down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The whispers followed me, swirling around me like a malevolent storm. I reached the elevator, desperate to escape, but it refused to respond to my frantic button presses. In my panic, I sprinted for the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. The whispers grew louder, the voices now distinct and anguished. They spoke of pain, suffering, and an insatiable hunger for release. I burst through the door to the rooftop, gasping for breath. The night air was icy, and the stars overhead seemed to shimmer with malevolence. I felt a presence behind me and turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing there, her eyes fixed on mine. "Join us," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody. "Join us in the darkness." I backed away from her, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. I had to escape, had to find a way out of this nightmare. With one final, desperate push, I hurled myself over the edge of the rooftop, plummeting into the abyss below. As I fell, I heard the whispers growing louder, their voices merging into a cacophony of agony and despair. And then, just before I lost consciousness, I saw them, the shadowy figures from the window, reaching out to claim me. When I awoke, I was back in the hospital bed, my body battered and bruised. The sun streamed in through the window, casting a warm and comforting glow.